Hello, this week I am bringing yet another book with a musical bend to it, with the usual caveat that despite my name, I am not the sibling that got the musical talent in the family. However, having a brother who has very seriously studied music and gone on to be a music teacher, as well as dabbling in oboe as a teen, did give me at least some frame of reference for Maddalena and the Dark by Julia Fine. Now, I'm going to admit that this book was not at all what I expected. To be fair, I don't know what I was expecting. Actually, that's kind of a lie. The one thing I went in expecting was a sense of the odd, because I have read Julia Fine's What Should Be Wild, as well as The Upstairs House, which I have talked about for a previous Feature Friday when that came out, if you want to jump back for that at any point. And while those are two very vastly different books, they share the commonality of having this sense of the weird or the odd to them. And so while this book is again a very different book than either of those two, I went in expecting that. Additionally, I did go to her book tour stop in Chicago when the book came out, and that did slightly reinforce my expectation for the weird or the odd or something looming or dangerous in the background of this book, as well as Julia Fine talking about Olivia Rodrigo as an inspiration for this book and the kind of charge I expected that to bring to the table, as well as it focusing and from the point of view of two teenage girls in a very intense friendship. Having read the blurb before that book release, I kind of expected there to be a sapphic angle of some kind to this relationship. The book release conversation made me doubt that, and then reading it, I again went back to those initial instincts just a little bit, and I'm not sure how well that was handled, to be completely honest. That charge was definitely there to a certain extent, but we'll talk all of the charges of this book as we dig further in. And charge is kind of an odd word to use for a novel that is really languid and fluid in a lot of ways, and not just because its setting is Venice. The closest reading comparison I have quickly out of my own reading life is Matrix by Lauren Groff, which follows a nunnery in the time of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Maddalena and the Dark follows two young girls, 15 years old, as they are on this verge of womanhood. They are moving from girlhood to womanhood and really facing down the future. And so much of this book is really sitting in like that moment right before they have to make that decision about the rest of their lives, and this idea that there is danger no matter what they choose. So we start out with Maddalena, who is our kind of entry into the larger world here, because she is a daughter of gentry. However, she is dealing with a sullied reputation due to her mother's indiscretions, and she and potentially her youngest brother, who is the family's hopes of kind of continuing the name, because it is set in 1717. And so we are also on this verge of the old world and the new world in some ways. Granted, we could say that about just about any era, but especially with the setting of Venice as well, which I don't really explore that much as a reader in historical fiction. There's a jaunt to Venice in the Thomas Cromwell trilogy by Hilary Mantel, and usually I am used to interacting with this kind of version of Venice through a fantasy lens, because it is this kind of heightened atmosphere, especially as we are moving into kind of the height and excess of Carnival, which the whole narrative kind of builds to here. And so we start the novel with Maddalena during this ritual where the Doge of the city will basically go out and marry the sea in some kind of effort of protection. I am mostly getting my knowledge of this ritual. It was obviously mentioned at the beginning of the book, but I had a lot more context of it because of how Julia Fine talked about it during her discussion. So this ritual is a new beginning in a lot of ways, and it is also the beginning for Maddalena in this story, and maybe the end for Maddalena in this story. I don't know. It depends on how you view things, I guess. But she is basically told by her eldest brother that she is being sent to the Pieta, and apologies for my pronunciation, I am going off of my recollection of how Julia Fine pronounced it, which is a kind of orphanage, school of music, convent in some ways, where young girls without parents are basically trained up in music. And at the time of the book, the main composer for the Pieta is Vivaldi. And so he is a character that is always oddly at the very outskirts of the narrative. And for someone that I expected to loom very large in the story, he really didn't, which was really fascinating to me. And maybe that is just more because I don't know enough about him to kind of see where he is woven in more than his cameos. So she gets this piece of news that her freedom is basically being bartered away for the family's reputation, and to try and salvage the family's reputation and basically kind of present her as this excellent bride because they aren't getting marriage offers for her. Remember, she's 15. And so at this moment, she is obviously not happy about this. And she also looks down and sees this image of a woman in the water, and the woman had a violin. And so this is that first kind of element of the odd that we get in the story. And fair enough, it's fairly early on. And so we pick back up with Maddalena's introduction to the Pieta through the eyes of Louisa, who is a member of the Pieta and a second violin. I'm not going to remember as much of the really technical historical language in relation to how the Pieta was structured and how these girls kind of moved up the ranks and what they were considered at what time, but it was kind of an aging up, and then there were different ways these women could go. So they could become like a member of the performing body, they could get like married off at some point potentially, they could end up just teaching the youngest, but the appeal of being granted access to the more elite performing group was that they are often hired out for private parties for the rich and elite, or they just get to go out more, and they also get preferred treatment within the Pieta. Additionally, touched on a little bit, these are musical skills they've spent their entire lives cultivating. So Maddalena enters this world and kind of upsets the normal order. And I think one of the best ways this was described early in the novel is it upset the order because then the girls couldn't necessarily tell themselves that them being kept away, locked away in this place was what was best for them. It kind of ruined their illusion of being able to move about their day-to-day, thinking that the outside world was very remote because she was kind of bringing these reminders of the outside world in. Her brothers were visiting her occasionally, and they were getting glimpses of men in a way that they never really did before. And so, as you imagine, with the kind of new and shiny for teenage girls, there is a power play associated with being Maddalena's friend, and there is a lot of social capital that is associated with that. And at first, Louisa has no interest in playing that game. She is interested in keeping her head down and improving her playing, especially as she has really lofty dreams of being in this elite performing group, but she is currently second violin, and she's kind of always reminded of how she's not achieving to the extent she wants to be. She's never playing in public settings as well as she performs for herself in private practice, and so there's this weight that's resting on her shoulders in some ways, and this great desire. However, Maddalena sees her and believes that she is the woman she saw in the water, which as a reader, you're like, that's not a great sign. Why are we not interrogating this internally a little bit more? But they are still distant from one another. They still aren't necessarily friends at this point because mostly of Louisa's aloofness. However, in the same time, instead of going about her like sewing work or really focusing on her practicing of her instrument, Maddalena has been going off, and there is a mysterious gondolier who is always just waiting for her outside of the Pieta and takes her around the canals and also to this very mysterious shrine of a place. And this is the kind of odd that's existing here. It's definitely hinting, and we will get into more explicitly, a Faustian bargain. However, I was a little disappointed with the way that this was executed because it never really felt heightened enough to me. And I think we're going to circle back to that in a moment because I don't want to get too lost in this right now, but I promise that this like summary is almost over. So through these kind of excursions, she has been leaving. One day Louisa recognizes that she is out when I believe one of her brothers is coming to visit or has been announced. And so someone will soon be looking for her. And so she goes running out to find her, to collect her, and this leads to them bonding. This leads to an incredibly close friendship, and this leads to a bargain that Louisa makes to improve her playing, to be able to show herself to the world as the musician she aims to be. And this wish, as anyone who's seen Into the Woods could tell you, comes at a cost and sets into motion the rest of the book. Now, the cost of it, though, we definitely see, right? However, the wish of it all, the kind of magic of it all, feels very loose and distant to me, and the narrative itself does at times too. And at the beginning of the book, I do wonder if that's to kind of help set the scene of the Pieta, especially because these girls really aren't allowed to talk. And so it's this idea of how they're communicating in the minutia, the little glances, the way they hold their words, and what is important enough to say. And I love the idea of that, but I don't know if it was communicated as much through the language as I would have liked. The whole sense of it did keep me a little bit removed. And part of it too does go back to this idea that I haven't read a whole lot of historical fiction in Venice. And so this is setting a very specific world for me in a way that I would have liked it to be a little bit more specific, especially because we are creating such a confined insular world with the Pieta. And we do eventually get to see a little bit more of Venice. And I didn't really feel the difference between the two. I didn't feel like the place of the Pieta was as stifling as the kind of reality of it may have been. However, at the same time, Louisa may have not seen it as stifling. Maddalena sees it as a loss of freedom in a lot of ways, but in a way, as the story progresses, it's also this kind of in-between place, and this place where this very intense relationship with Louisa is protected because it's just the two of them. All of the other girls, yes, but they kind of start to exist outside of them within their own friendship. And I think that the way that the language is utilized sometimes can make the narrative feel kind of stagnant. And I do love historical fiction. However, this has that little extra element of the odd, a sense that something is supposed to be dangerous, even if that full danger doesn't feel tangible. And I think that some of it may be the kind of episodic jumping of the points of view, which is an interesting structure because we almost have this duet between Maddalena and Louisa, and there may be a better musical comparison to make there, admittedly. So if you've read this and have a better one, let me know. But this idea that we get different chapters from their points of view, third person point of view, but their point of view nonetheless. And so often the end of one chapter and the beginning of another will kind of dovetail. So we get to see a different perspective of action we've just experienced in a way that offers new information that kind of changes the reality of what we're looking at. And there is this kind of spiraling into what is reality, this idea of appearance versus action, from the setting and the idea of Carnival and the masks to Maddalena's reputation that this whole book really is about overcoming, to who Louisa is as a performer and her own private interior life, which has been very protected because it's all that is hers. And then the public-facing friendship of Maddalena and Louisa, and then the kind of messier interior. And I do want to swing back to the perception of female friendships here, but to kind of finish out the structure here, Fine originally mentioned that she was interested in writing the book as a piece of music in some way, in a way that doesn't really work in terms of translating one form of artistic expression to another. We talked about this a little bit with Natural Beauty as well, though I did have someone comment that is a musician that says it really did kind of tap into that musical instinct in a really tangible way. And I think here we're seeing that tapping into the musical instinct in that conversation between these two points of views. We are also seeing it in a lot of a reference in the way the book is structured, because it is told in seasons, which makes sense in the tracking of these two young women's lives and also makes sense in context of Vivaldi. And so the tracking of these two young women's lives, this idea of what options are available to them, what cost they have to pay to realize their futures and desires, and also this really complicated, really charged, again, to kind of circle back to that idea of female friendship. And these are girls, like I said, that are on the edge of womanhood. And so by all accounts, they really fall into that kind of Mean Girls realm. And I use that more in reference to a body of literature and books that came out when I was a teenager that really kind of talked about interpersonal dynamics between girls and young women for the first time in a really tangible, pointed way. So we're talking books like Odd Girl Out and Queen Bees and Wannabes, which partially inspired Mean Girls. And so there is often this real intensity to friendships between women, especially young women at this age, that is particularly charged. And especially in relation to talking about this book as inspired by Olivia Rodrigo, I was really excited to feel that danger and that angst and that emotion. And here I think it walked a fine line, because I think there was this sense of trying to suppress some of that, especially in relation to Louisa at the beginning. She was afraid to name what she wanted. She never wanted to say out loud that she wanted to be first violin. And then in the act of claiming that want, we see a cost to realizing that desire. And that was kind of tricky for me because I understand it narratively, but also it was really hard to read about this young girl who finally names something that she wants, finally grasps onto something in this world that she has been given no guide to. She's been in this protected place in a very insular, kind of myopic worldview, and suddenly the world opens for her a little bit. And I didn't always particularly like what naming her desires meant for her. And I think that the perspective of that may be different whether you're reading it looking forward or looking back. When you're looking forward, like if you were reading this as a teenager, it's a much more cynical view. If you're reading it as an adult looking back, well, it's still kind of a cynical view, but it's this idea of the commentary of what we may have given up at some point in our lives because society demands it of us. But at the same time, I started this thought with this idea of like this female friendship and this intense friendship. And it was intimated. There were these moments, but I also felt like we almost always ended a beat too early for the thing to really land and stick, because I at first admittedly had trouble with the emotional buy-in of how intense this friendship had moved and how quickly, and even knowing how intense and how quickly friendships like that can move, which is important because so much of that relationship and so many relationships like it rely so much on subtleties, as well as the strength of feeling, which can almost border on obsession at some times. And I felt like the narrative wanted me to feel that that's where we were landing with these two, and I didn't always feel it. And it really should have, because we already had this world with this obsession with music. And so the setup of those two things mirroring each other is incredibly smart. It just didn't feel like we ever pushed fully over the edge. And that's what I felt about the kind of supernatural angle to all of this as well. I'll admit that I was almost a little confused by it because it felt like it was supposed to have more weight than it felt to me like a reader that it did, especially with this kind of mysterious gondolier and how he started to appear more as the narrative went on. And it may just be that I missed something, that it is moving in those subtleties and I just didn't grasp onto it strongly enough, or it could also just be that it was a little too thin. And I loved the metaphor it was playing with, this idea of wishes and wants, but also this idea of fate in some ways, because through all of this, Maddalena's kind of initial vision is lurking in the background. Like, will this come to fruition? What was that vision? What is happening? Especially as we see, particularly Maddalena, so protective of Louisa. And so these shorter language chapters are covering a lot of narrative distance. And there is this like slight disconnect between the kind of languidness of the prose combined with the tension, at least I felt like was supposed to be building. At the same time, I can so easily just slip into Julia Fine's prose. It is very much a personal preference. I don't think it's going to work for everyone, but I do kind of love sitting in it. And in some ways, the kind of windiness of the prose, which also kind of mirrors the windiness of the canals, builds a kind of tension through this lack of action, through this sense of suspension, and this idea that so little choice remains to these young women. So it's that kind of slow build in many ways. And so I think if there was just some more immediacy in a few of the elements, it would have landed a little bit better for me. But there was just something that felt like it could have gone that extra little bit to really cut to the core. As it stands, I would definitely still recommend reading this, but I think it is much more of a paperback read than a hardcover read, unfortunately. But I also feel like historical fiction lends itself better often to paperback. We sit in a slowness and stillness a little bit better sometimes in paperback, or at least I do, but also in a reading world right now that feels very focused on being really punchy, being really quippy. I do appreciate the differentiation in the language here and that it's trying something different narratively. And I like that Fine always gives us something slightly different in her books so far. And I really enjoyed exploring this world. I just would have enjoyed going a little deeper in all of it. In retrospect, it very much is a character study and character driven. And so we are really exploring the internal worlds of these young women, and the external is there in as much as it informs those internal worlds, but we are not going to explore the external world at the cost of that emotional truth, if that makes sense. However, there were again a couple of beats that seemed to skip, so I couldn't track the emotional truth quite as cleanly as I would have liked, but I still enjoyed my reading experience with this one, even if I admittedly didn't love it like I expected to. But if you've read this one, as always, I'm incredibly interested to hear your perspective on it, so let me know below. Thank you for hanging out and having any interest in my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, and yeah, bye.